Hello again over there. Welcome back again to this another amazing video on Spring Boot playlist. If you are interested in learning Spring Boot for developing REST APIs, then I guess this is the right place for you to follow along. And in this particular video on Spring Boot, we are going to explain how to implement the service layer and how to create the service interface and how to create the service implementation. And before we go deep into this content of the video, I would like us to take a recap of the previous video that we covered and see what we covered, because this video is very much dependent on the previous video. And if you have not watched, I would urge you just take 10 minutes of your time to go and watch the previous video on Spring Data and Spring Data JPA before you can now look on how to implement the service layer. Alright, so in the previous video, we looked on how to we created a symbol, a Spring entity, a student entity with the following properties. And then we also created a simple JPA persistence interface, which extends from a JPA repository. And we specified the kind of the entity that we are going to persist. So if you go back to the code, you can see that this is the simple interface, I mean the simple entity which we created in the previous lesson. This is the student entity with the following fields, and then we also created the corresponding repository for it, the JPA repository, where we specified the entity. And in this particular video, we are now going to move forward and implement the next layer on this architecture, which is the service layer. So we are going to create a simple service where we create one business logic for adding the student to the database, and then we are going to create the interface and also create the implementation of that interface. So this is the specific that we will do. So we will create the interface first with just one method declared, and then we are going to create the service class which implements this interface and implements the method declared in that interface. And then after that, we are going to inject the JPA repository which we created in the previous class, so that we can use that JPA repository to perform the CRUD operation, which is adding the student to the database. And then in the subsequent video, we will now create one endpoint API in the controller class, which will then make use of this service class in order to now add the student on the database. So without waste of time, let us go straight to the code and then demonstrate how we can implement the service layer. So for me and the way I recommend for you also to implement the service layer is normally to create a different package for storing all your service classes. Normally when you work on a very large project, then you are going to find out that you have a lot of service classes which are implementing different methods. So it is good to create a different package which keeps all the service classes. So I'm going to create a new package here, and I'm going to call it the student service, or I'm just going to call it the service package. So this is where I will keep all my service classes. So in this package called service, I'm going to create a new interface which I will call it the student interface, or the student service. And this should be an interface instead of a class. So I'm going to create that interface, and in this interface for now I'm going just to declare one method. So this is just one method to add the student to the database. Method to add the student. Alright, so here I'm going to declare this method as a public method. It should return the type of student, and the method name is add student. And then it takes the parameter of the student type, and that's all the method that I need. So here I'm going to go ahead and import this student class. Then after creating this interface, you now need to create a new class which must implement this interface. All right, and when you implement this interface, then you are going to override all this method here and make sure you provide the implementation for this method. If you don't provide the implementation for this method, then by default this method will provide null, will return null. So for you to create that class, I'm going to create another separate subfolder within the serves folder, and I'm going to call it serves implementation. Serves implementation. This is the package where I am going to keep all my implementation classes. All right. Let me rename it. That is supposed to be service, not serve. So I'm going to provide supposed to be service class. So in this package, I'm going to again create a new class now, which must implement this interface. So I'm going to create, and I'm going to call it a student repository, student service. Student service implementation class. So this is the class which must implement this. So I'm going to directly implement the student service interface. This is the interface which I need to implement here. And when I implement that interface, then I need to implement also the methods which are declared in that interface. All right. So I'm going to click implement, and for now I only have one method, so I'm going to implement that method. And you can see by default it returns null, because if you don't provide any implementation, then it is going to return the null value. So to avoid that, I'm going to delete this code, and then I'm going to provide my own implementation for adding the student. All right, so I'm going to, before that, for you to add the student or for you to perform any CRUD operation on your database or on your entity, then you need the student, you need the JPA repository which we created here, because this is the JPA repository which persists this entity in your database. It is this JPA repository that interacts with your database. So for you to be able to use it, then you need to inject it in this particular file, in this particular class. So I'm going to use another annotation called out to where, and this is the annotation which is used to inject any component that you need. So I'm going to inject this student JPA repository. So I'm going to declare a private variable of the type student JPA repository, and this I'm going to import it. So import this particular component, and then it is going to be student repository, or just let me call this student repository. All right, now that you have this repository interface or repository class here, then you can be able to use it within this method in order to add whatever student that you need to add. All right, how do you use that one here in this? So you come in this method, and you need to return now that student repository, this one, and then you call this particular method here called the save method. So this is the method which is provided by the JPA repository, and this method is used to add or to save a new entity into the database. So now we need to specify which entity are we saving. So we are going to save the student entity, because this repository, this student repository, is only persisting the student entity here. So if you provide a different entity to this repository, then this repository is going to throw an error because it is not persisting that particular entity. Now this is the method, this is the simple implementation of it. Maybe for your case you may need some more complex implementation. Maybe first of all, for some application you need to validate this student data which is provided, to ensure that none of this data is null before you really save it. But for our case here, we've just provided a very simple implementation, and in the next videos and in the next upcoming videos, we will now look on how to implement more complex logic. For example, we need to save a student. We must first of all check that all the field of the students are provided, none of it is null. We need to ensure that this student does not exist before in the database, and then after that we need now to save the student. So this is what we mean by the logic, and all this logic should be defined and declared in your serves layer, that is the serves class. And then also, before we end on this video, we need to make sure that we annotate this particular class with another annotation called the serves annotation. So this is the annotation which will also help us to make this class a serves layer, and it tells it tells Spring Boot that it should declare this class as a component, so that you can be able to outware it and inject it like this repository. When you go to the repository, we have added this annotation which also applies the same function. You can see they are from the same stereotype library. So this serves annotation, it tells the Spring to make this class a component, a Spring Boot component, which you can then be able to reuse it by injecting it, and it can be able to be auto-injected as a dependency, so that later when we implement the controller endpoint, we need to outware this student serves implementation class, so that we can call this method add student, and then this method will in turn call the repository, and the repository will call the save method, which will then now interact with the database now to save the student to the database. All right. So this is the simple implementation, and I hope you really find this content very useful to your needs. And I will want us to pause this video here, and then in the next video we look on how to create the endpoint now in the controller, which will now call this serves layer, and the serves layer calls the repository. The repository calls the database to save the data. And then in the last video now, we are going to perform the testing, so that we can test whether whatever we have created is now working end to end, by now providing calling this endpoint in our Postman client and providing the student detail in our Postman client. Then we see whether we have saved the student. All right. Otherwise, I hope the content was useful, and see you again in the next video.